Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Pappas. I'm really excited to be giving this talk today. I just wish I could be in Berlin with all of you instead of joining virtually, but I'm glad I can join virtually nonetheless. I'm really excited to give this talk on fostering collaboration, versatility, and sustainability through remote language documentation. So I'll be discussing a case study of basically how I dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic in my language documentation processes. Conducting work in Indonesia on the Hawu language, which this work was funded by the National Science Foundation, and what I think we can learn from these coping mechanisms moving forward. So just to kind of situate where my headspace is within the broader field of language documentation, one of the bigger changes, one of the most relevant changes in language documentation over the past decade, in addition to new technological advancements and incorporating those technological advancements, is the fact that we have community members who are playing an increasingly larger role in documentary practices. So community members aren't just serving as consultants, but rather agents within the project who are trained in the tools and the methods and the theories necessary to do the work, language documentation work. And work has shown that this kind of community engagement actually leads to better language documentation with more sustainable documentation, documentation that more closely aligns with both the linguists and the community members' goals, and documentation that more accurately reflects community knowledge and patterns of language use. And so the past few years I've been working in Hawu, with Hawu in Eastern Indonesia. So Hawu was spoken in the province of East Nusa Tenggara. If you take a look at Indonesia here, you can kind of get your bearings with Java and Borneo. And Hawu is spoken in this region in the southeast on two islands, Sabu and Raijua. Now, Hawu is the only language spoken on these two islands, or the only native language to these two islands. And so when we turn to vitality, we actually see that Hawu, on a vitality scale, seems relatively vital. Ethnologue places it at about 100,000 speakers, but today I would suggest that that's probably closer to about 60,000. We have active language shift occurring on Sabu Island. People are mostly bilingual in Indonesian or Malay. There are very few monolingual Hawu speakers, save for a few elderly speakers. And even though Hawu is still used in daily use, particularly in the villages, it's really restricted to informal domains. So we don't see it in domains of government and religion and education. So in a way, it's a very typical situation of language shift. And we also have a very complex dialect situation in Hawu with 5 different dialects shown here in the map on the right that include Mehara, Seba, Timu, Liai, and Raijua. And the differences between these dialects, which isn't entirely understood yet, might be leading towards the language shift in order to kind of cross dialectal lines. So I first began working with Hawu in 2018. This is when I met my consultants, when I went to Indonesia to conduct a language documentation training workshop in Kupang, the capital city of East Nusa Tenggara. And I mention this because the work that we conducted during the pandemic wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for their interest in conducting language documentation work and their training to do this kind of work. So those were 2 necessary prerequisites to be able to even consider doing these kinds of projects. So after 2018, we stayed in touch. We kind of started planning a project for me to come back. And in 2019, I returned to Sabu, or I went to Sabu for the first time, and I conducted 2 months in the field in 2019. And this was a very interesting time because Naomi and Leonardo had a whole year to kind of think about what they wanted to document and how they wanted to do it. And so I arrived and they had a plan. And they really led the documentation. They knew who they wanted to talk to, what kind of data they wanted to collect, where they wanted to get it. And so it was a very interesting experience on my part, who felt like I was kind of not contributing at all. Looking back, it was a very good moment of collaboration between all of us. And in the end, we ended up getting several different genres, all related to cultural traditions. So these included narratives, interviews, genealogy chants, songs. And in total, we collected about 14 hours of data, 7 of natural speech data, and 7 of elicitation and task completion data. And in that time, we transcribed about 4 hours of the data. Then in 2020 and 2021, I had been anticipating returning to Sabu for a much longer field work experience, approximately 4 months. Now, as happened to all of us, that didn't happen because of the pandemic. And the intention had been to go collect data that was going to contribute to my dissertation. And so in these first months of the pandemic, I considered changing my topic. I considered just waiting and resuming research whenever the pandemic ended. Glad I didn't do that option. But eventually in the fall of 2020, I decided, you know what, I'm just going to see what kind of data I can get. And so in October 2020, Naomi, Leonardo, and I began figuring out how we were going to do the kind of research we had wanted to do, but without my presence there. And we ended up over the course of about 13 months, we began collecting data in December 2020 and went until January 2022, 13 to 14 months. We collected about 10.5 hours of data, and all of it was natural speech data, mostly consisting of stories and some interviews. In total, we transcribed about 8 hours of data. So this was our workflow. We spent about 2 months in the preparation phase. So October and November of 2020, we were preparing to do the work. This required buying equipment and sending it to Indonesia, getting cloud sharing services up so that we could share data, and setting up money transfer services so I could send money to Naomi and Leonardo to conduct the work. And then once we kind of had all of that settled, they kind of took the reins. They would set up recording sessions, they recorded audio and video, they collected metadata, transcribed recordings, translated recordings into Indonesian, and they also kept track of GPS data when appropriate. Then they would send all of that to me over Google Drive, and I would take the time to translate the recordings into English, annotate the recordings for grammatical and, when appropriate, gestural features, and I would offer notes and ask questions. Send everything back to them where they discussed the questions, answered them, and checked my translation. And then finally, they'd send it back to me. I'd clean up the archives, or I'd clean up the transcriptions and then archive the data. So we had a lot of this back and forth, somewhat complex, but it worked for us. Okay. However, there was a lot of challenges to putting together this work, making sure we accounted for everything, and then actually conducting the documentation was challenging as well. One of the big things was that we weren't able to video chat very often. There isn't great service on Sapu, and especially during the rainy season and the pandemic restrictions on movement, we weren't always able to access internet. And so we weren't able to video chat very often, which led to a lot of things going much slower. So collecting data was slower, and there was less data collection. So if you take a look at the 2 months that I was there, we collected about 14 hours of data. Now, a lot of that was elicitation, but we collected about 14 hours of data to transcribe 4. But over the course of the year that we were working, we collected about 10.5 and transcribed 8. Part of that was the product of, again, not always being able to move around, prioritizing transcription in those times when it wasn't safe to be around people or safe to travel. So we did have less data collection, and everything was slower. During the first 2 months of data collection, I didn't see any data. I knew they were collecting data. I knew it was probably going great, but getting used to that uploading of data, and again, having good enough service to be able to upload it, led to points where sometimes I wasn't seeing the data for a good month or 2 after it was collected, which led to our conversations around the recordings and the transcriptions to become less rich, right? We weren't able to have these in-depth conversations. It was more restricted to text. which just doesn't have the same feel. And everything, again, was more detached. So I wasn't, if there was something interesting in the data that I wanted to kind of test, that was a lot harder to do, especially if it was recorded 2 months ago and I found it, and it would be difficult to test certain things or put the restrictions, the controls in to be able to test certain things. So not everything was testable because of timing and stuff like that. But there were a lot of benefits to the data collection as well. We found that recorded individuals were much more comfortable. When I was there, people who tended to sit cross-legged in the middle of the room, very rigid and formal. But without me, people tended to lean. You can see this man is leaning on some pillows. One man told a story. He was totally laying down with his head propped up. So there's a lot more comfort in bodies, and that also translated to speech. We saw longer and more natural recordings. So when I was in Sabu, people would tailor recordings to me. They would say something like, I want to tell my American sister this story. And the speech would be tailored towards a foreigner. As opposed to in these recordings, we saw much more natural interactions between people. And that also came out in the length. So 4 to 5 minutes on average for the 2019 data when I was there, versus 15 minutes on average, where they would, that was kind of the point where people would say, I'm done, I don't have anything else to say. So we saw a huge difference in how long the recordings were and how natural they were. And because the collaborators were part of the language community, we found that they could really record whenever they wanted. If they were going to an event and they thought there'd be good, cool language, they'd take the recordings, the recording equipment. If they really wanted to talk to someone, they could take the time to kind of put that together. There wasn't any deadline of, oh, Leah is leaving soon, so we have to do it soon. And so there was a lot more flexibility in what they could collect. They had access to cultural knowledge and cultural situations that I did not necessarily have access to when I was there, which led to more extensive and diverse documentation. And finally, this gave, on a financial side, it gave financial support to a community at a time when it was much needed. So just like in America, people didn't have jobs during the pandemic. Leonardo and Naomi were not working. They weren't able to. And so having that financial support, taking the money that basically was supposed to support me going to Indonesia and staying there, taking those funds and instead diverting them to the speakers and Leonardo and Naomi, I felt was in a way a much better use of those funds, making sure that those went to the community. So moving forward, I think it's important to keep the challenges and the benefits in mind. And if we're really trying to achieve diverse, multifunctional language documentation corpora, then it would be very useful to embrace both in-person and remote methods of language documentation. And my system is not the system that other people came up with, right? Everyone's come up with their own variation of conducting language documentation abroad or not in the community. And so taking those and not just saying, great, I can go back to the community, I don't have to do this anymore. Instead saying, how can I use these in the future? And in planning language documentation projects, plan them with that idea in mind, that actually remote documentation can be part of this project. And in that way, you have that intense documentation where you can follow up and ask questions and have lots of great conversations when the linguist is there, while also having a more kind of community-led, community-centered and paced documentation, and having the best of both of those worlds. This would embrace technological advancements that have been coming about in the past decade: extended internet access, cloud sharing, free messaging apps, free money sending apps. And it also is a way to make sure that community training is prioritized and community engagement is actually happening in language documentation by saying, not all of this needs to happen while I'm there, but I'll still give the support necessary to make sure it's happening. And finally, I do think it's a better use of funding in some ways, where we can ask in grants and everything, we can take more of the money that might have been used for the linguist to spend more time in the field and take that and instead divert it to the community, so that doing language work is actually benefiting them. So moving forward, incorporating both these in-person and remote research methods will lead to a more versatile and sustainable project that captures both the needs of the linguist and the community members. I'm really interested to hear all of your thoughts. Thank you so much.